Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's good to be with you on this Thursday, January 20th. Here is some of what we're talking about tonight. The three officers who witnessed the murder of George Floyd are about to stand trial. We'll dig into new research on how often police officers are prosecuted and how rarely they are convicted. The January 6th committee says it wants to speak to Ivanka Trump. Meanwhile, the top prosecutor in Atlanta wants a grand jury to look into President Trump's interference after the 2020 election. We'll sum up where all these investigations stand now. Also, President Biden plans to give away hundreds of millions of N95 masks, and thankfully, at least one manufacturer seems confident about keeping up with demand. And the president began his presidency with some big promises to historically black colleges and universities. Now, some students say they don't know if the administration will follow through in year two. All right, let's begin tonight in St. Paul, Minnesota. The jury is in place for a federal civil rights trial over the murder of George Floyd. You remember last year, a jury convicted former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Last month, he pled guilty to federal civil rights charges. This trial involves the three other officers who were there that day: Thomas Kiernan Lane, Tu Tao, and J. Alexander King. Prosecutors charged them with willfully depriving Mr. Floyd of his constitutional rights while acting under government authority, or what's called color of law. Officers Tao and King face an additional charge for not trying to stop Derek Chauvin. All three of them are pleading not guilty to charges of abusing their power as police officers. NBC's Megan Fitzgerald starts us off tonight.
Jury selection is complete in the trial, the federal trial against three former Minneapolis police officers who are charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights. Basically, what these officers are charged with, J. Alexander King, along with Tu Tao and Thomas Lane, they are charged with seeing that George Floyd needed help and not doing anything about it, not helping him, not rendering aid. We know that Tao, along with King, are also being charged with failing to stop the action that contributed to George Floyd's death. Now, we talked to legal experts who say this is an incredibly fast timeline to be able to choose a 12-person jury with 6 alternates, given how high profile this case is. But what we can deduce from this is that both sides, the prosecution and the defense, were satisfied with the jurors that they selected today. The judge had already said in the very beginning that his goal is to make sure that this trial moves along as expeditiously as possible, wanting to make sure that this happens quick because he's concerned of the coronavirus and that there could be an outbreak inside the courtroom, which is why we see these 6 alternate jurors. He's also calling for opening statements to begin on Monday and for this trial to hopefully wrap, he says, in 4 weeks, which is certainly a lot faster, a quicker timeline than what we saw in the spring when Derek Chauvin was on trial.
That was NBC's Megan Fitzgerald starting us off from the federal courthouse in St. Paul. Now, this case is just one example of how law enforcement accountability is changing. New research is showing how often officers are charged and convicted after shooting someone on duty. These data come from the Police Integrity Research Group at Bowling Green State University. By their count, since the year 2005, 155 on-duty officers have been charged with murder or manslaughter. 155. 51 of them have been convicted. 56 were not. 48 of those cases are still pending. Joining us now is this report's author. Phil Stinson is a professor of criminal justice at Bowling Green State. Professor Stinson, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you.
Can you break apart some of the numbers about convictions for us? For example, how many of them are by jury? How many of these are verdicts handed down from the bench? Dig into that particular statistic a bit more.
Well, when we look at the cases, the 51 cases, and again, this is data that I've collected since 2005, and we're dealing with a very small sample here, but of those 155 officers charged, 21 of the officers actually entered guilty pleas. 29 were found guilty in jury trials, and just one of the officers was found guilty in a bench trial. In other words, a trial where the judge was sitting as the trier of fact without a jury present. So it's very rare in these cases that officers are actually charged, and it's even rarer that we see officers convicted in these cases. And it seems that quite oftentimes in the case of jury trials, that jurors are very reluctant to second guess the split-second decisions of on-duty police officers in potentially violent street encounters. And we see the same thing with bench trials, because we've actually had, I think, 9 cases where officers were acquitted at bench trials. So very difficult to get a conviction in these cases.
Talk about that a little bit more, Professor, because that reticence to second guess an officer is not just something that's cultural. The law also is designed to give officers a little bit of deference in terms of their split-second decision-making, right?
Well, the general standard under 2 cases from the U.S. Supreme Court of the 1980s is that a police officer is justified in using deadly force if the officer has a reasonable apprehension of an imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death being imposed against the officer or someone else. What we see in these cases is that's a reasonable officer standard. In other words, it's an objective standard, what a reasonable officer without the benefit of hindsight would have perceived. What we see in these cases is that in order for an officer to even be charged, let alone convicted, it has to be so over the top that their actions can't be rationally explained. And anything short of that, it's very difficult to get a conviction.
What did you make of the years in which these charges came? If you look at the list that's there right now, last year you noted was the year where you saw the most charges, 2021, followed by 2015, where there were 18 charges. How much of that do you think is impacted by just what was going on in the zeitgeist in the culture? I mean, George Floyd died in 2020, and then 2021, highest number of charges thus far. Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and then second highest number of charges in 2015. How much of this is cultural impact?
Well, we now know from the work of the Washington Post that between 900 and 1,000 times each and every year, since they've started collecting the data in 2015, that on-duty police officers shoot and kill someone. And as you said, from my research, the most we've seen in terms of officers charged is 21 last year, in the year 2021. However, when you dig down and look at those cases, what we see is that in one instance, 5 of the officers charged were officers from Oklahoma City. They were all charged out of the same shooting incident. So when we look at the number of incidents, it's amazingly static each year. We see roughly the same number of incidents. So when we see these numbers go up, it's not statistically significant in terms of increases. I had frankly expected after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and we really had a tipping point where everybody was paying attention to these incidents, whereas people weren't before that. I thought we'd see more officers being charged, but the fact of the matter is it's fairly consistent from year to year in terms of the numbers of officers charged. So out of 900 or 1,000 instances where on-duty officers shoot and kill someone, we're still only seeing about 2% of the time are officers actually charged in those cases.
What do you make of the ratio of the total number of on-duty shootings to the number of charges there are? I mean, every time an officer pulls the trigger, they're not necessarily going to hit somebody, they're not necessarily going to kill somebody, and that killing is not necessarily going to be called into question. I'm sure some people look at this number and say that makes sense. Others might look at the number and go, that's it for all of the shootings that there are? What do you make of that ratio?
Well, I have to assume in all the other instances where officers are not charged, it's because investigators and or prosecutors have made a determination that the officer's actions were legally justified. In other words, they decided that a reasonable officer in that situation would have perceived an imminent threat. The problem with that, though, is with that legal standard, there are many instances where officers are not charged, where police chiefs, where prosecutors have to tell the victim, surviving family members and loved ones, that while they're not charging the officer because they found the officer's actions were legally justified, they also found that the shooting was inappropriate, unnecessary, and perhaps violated agency policy. So there's a real disconnect. That's a very difficult concept to explain to a victim's family members. It doesn't really make sense to people. So I think we have to really reconsider this going forward. Part of the bigger idea of needing police reforms and reimagining policing, we also need to take a closer look at that legal standard and see if it's really workable in the current form.
One of the other statistics that came up was the object that the victim of the shooting was carrying that the officer used to make that split-second calculus, namely whether they had a gun or whether they did not. Of the officers who were charged, 59 of them were shooting a victim who had some kind of weapon or object other than a gun. 29 of the people who were shot were armed with a gun. That interested me partly because I can't tell you how many cases I've seen where an officer was in an encounter, suspect turns around, officer fires, says they think they saw something that looked like a weapon, and it turned out to be a scale for weighing cannabis or something like that, some object
or a cell phone
that turned out not to be dangerous or deadly.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're learning a lot more about these incidents from video recordings, from body-worn camera footage that officers have, from dash cam videos, from citizens who take videos with their smartphones, from surveillance cameras at people's homes, at businesses. And sometimes what we're seeing is that the statements made by officers after these incidents, the written reports they make, the statements that the officers involved make to investigators, what we're finding is often they're factually inconsistent with the video evidence. In other words, in the past, the police have always owned the narrative in these incidents, and the video footage is sometimes telling a different story. And I think that's important for investigators and prosecutors in making decisions and trying to determine what actually happened and not solely relying on the police narrative as the factual basis in making their decisions.
One more statistic I wanted to share. You also studied the racial breakdown of the officers in completed cases, meaning they were found either guilty or not guilty. We see that among non-black officers, 43 were convicted, 49 were not. Among black officers, 8 were convicted, 7 were not. So a slightly more even conviction rate for black officers, biasing ever so slightly toward convictions. Non-black officers a bit more likely to not be convicted than to be convicted. What did you make of that?
Well, not much yet, because we have such a small sample. The data, we just don't have enough data to draw any conclusions on it. I do think that it's important that we collect that data, and that over time, I'm hoping that, unfortunately, we'll have more cases, but that'll give us the opportunity to try to make sense and drill down on that and see if we see any statistically significant patterns that develop over time.
And very briefly, before I let you go, is the difficulty in the data, is it just a matter of time, the small data set, or have you found that there are impediments to getting data about law enforcement? We know there are gaps in terms of our overall statistical knowledge, even of how many times law enforcement officers fire their weapons. Are you finding impediments from law enforcement to getting the data you're looking for, or is it just typical kind of statistical challenges before we go?
Well, I don't rely on official data from law enforcement agencies. All of my research is based on 48 Google alerts I set up back in 2004 and 2005 that constantly crawl the Google News search engine, and we rely on that. Now, once we learn about these cases through the news media, we do try to get court records when they're publicly available or otherwise that we can get our hands on, and police reports, those kinds of things. But as the U.S. Justice Department has found, it's very difficult to collect data from the more than 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies across the country, because those data collection efforts of the Justice Department are voluntary on the part of those agencies. They just, or even if there's some sort of requirement, many agencies just don't comply. So that's why I rely on other types of methodologies to collect data, because it's very difficult to collect data and rely on law enforcement agencies.
Bowling Green criminal justice professor Phil Stinson. Professor, I appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Oh, take care.
Still to come, there was a lot of movement this week on the January 6th investigation, including some headlines about the Trump family. We'll bring you up to speed next. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. The legal pressure on former President Trump is growing on his family business for January 6th and for his actions leading up to it. First, his attempts to sway the 2020 election. Today, the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, that's Atlanta, asked for a special grand jury to help investigate. District Attorney Fannie Willis says she needs the grand jury's subpoena power. Multiple witnesses have apparently refused to cooperate with her investigation. The probe involves that now infamous call Mr. Trump made to Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break. We have that in spades already, or we can keep it going. But that's not fair to the voters of Georgia because they're going to see what happened. And they're going to see what happened.
In a statement today, the former president described his call as perfect. He also repeated an array of his debunked claims of widespread voter fraud. In addition to Georgia, another investigation is growing here in New York. Attorney General Letitia James is accusing the Trump Organization of fraudulent or misleading practices. In a court filing this week, she accused the company of misrepresenting the value of its assets. That includes allegedly submitting misleading appraisals to the IRS. Ms. James also called out Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr. for apparently trying to defy a subpoena. She said that she will take legal action to make them comply. Also today, the January 6th committee said it wants to hear from Ivanka Trump too. But right now, they're not forcing her to talk. The committee is asking her to participate voluntarily. At issue is her conversation with her father as the Capitol was attacked.
We know as he was sitting there in the dining room next to the Oval Office, members of his staff were pleading with him to go on television, to tell people to stop. We know Leader McCarthy was pleading with him to do that. We know members of his family. We know his daughter. We have firsthand testimony that his daughter Ivanka went in at least twice to ask him to please stop this violence.
Let's dig into all of this with Barbara McQuade. She's a former U.S. attorney in Michigan, a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, and an NBC News legal contributor. Professor McQuade, let's start with the January 6th committee. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the committee with regard to some documents that they had been looking for. What role does that play in the investigation?
I think this is a really significant ruling because the court did not focus on whether it's a former president or the current president who has executive privilege. They said they didn't need to reach that issue because nothing about this is privilege. You know, the executive privilege, Jonathan, is Joshua, is a qualified privilege. It's not an absolute privilege. And so that means that it can yield when there's a greater public interest. And so what the court said is the fact-finding of the January 6th committee is more important than any assertion of privilege to our country.
Dig into that a little bit more. I'm sure there's still people who are on either side of this who think that, you know, the president's privilege, he's a president, it's over with, that door needs to be closed, and others who want all the information the committee is asking for to come out. Dig a little further into that idea of a qualified privilege. What does that mean?
I think it means certainly in some contexts the privilege will continue. And the idea behind it is a policy reason. It is we want to promote candor within the highest levels of the executive branch so that people can feel they can have frank decisions with the president and not worry that their statements may be used later. But just as we saw in the Nixon case, where the court said the grand jury investigation into wrongdoing by President Nixon was more important than that privilege, it had to yield. And so here, what we're seeing is the Supreme Court saying that this January 6th attack and Congress's efforts to get to the bottom of it are important, and so important that they overshadow the privilege in this case. They mostly adopted the reasoning of the court below, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which said it's hard to imagine anything more in the wheelhouse of Congress than an attack on its own house. And so the idea that they can't obtain these documents has been debunked. The idea that these are privileged has been debunked. And so I think that opens the door not only for these documents, which could be a real treasure trove, but for all these other assertions of executive privilege from people like Mark Meadows and perhaps Ivanka Trump. I think that is now a loser argument, and I think it allows the committee to be a little more aggressive in seeking this testimony.
We'll come back to the Ivanka Trump matter in just a minute, but let's go now to Georgia and the Fulton County District Attorney's request for a grand jury. How do you think that that might play out?
Well, I think she'll get her grand jury as long as she makes a showing to the chief judge and the judge puts it to a vote of the other judges on the court. They will grant it. And she has made the case that this is a complex investigation. She says there is reasonable cause to believe that a crime was committed here, but the nature of it is complex, and it is likely to exceed the normal life of a grand jury, which is only 2 months. And so for that reason, she wants a special grand jury that can focus all of its attention on this one case. Ordinarily, the grand jury is sitting and hearing all kinds of cases all day. You know, a murder case, a home invasion case, an arson case all day. And instead, what she wants is focused attention on this. The other reason she says she wants it is that there are some people who have said, you know, I am not going to help you voluntarily, but if you give me a subpoena, of course, I will comply with that. The former Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, for example, has made that statement. And so getting that testimony is critically important. So I think she'll get her grand jury. Now, whether that leads to an ultimate indictment, the special grand jury would have to issue a report, and from that information, she would have to present it to a regular grand jury if she can demonstrate sufficient evidence of probable cause that a crime was committed. But it seems like this is a significant step in the investigation that is based on her belief that she has sufficient evidence to merit further investigation.
Let's get to a few other things quickly. On Tuesday, the committee subpoenaed 4 of Mr. Trump's lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, Sidney Powell, and Boris Epstein. I wonder if their subpoenas have to do with the fact that they publicly spread an array of debunked claims, most of which you tried to find a clip of some of these to air on the program, and there's not a truth sandwich big enough to bite into these. But I wonder how that actually plays into the committee's investigation. Is that why they want to talk to them, or could there be more to it?
Well, it seems to me that based on the public statements they have made, it does appear that they had this coordinated effort to use the courts to try to throw out votes in certain states. Here in Michigan, they had a big effort. Sidney Powell led an effort here in Michigan, filed a lawsuit. It was dismissed. She was sanctioned by the court for filing a frivolous lawsuit. And I think thinking about the coordinated approach there could be very important for the committee. I think it's possible, likely even, that they'll raise attorney-client privilege as a basis to refuse to testify. But because their statements were public, any privilege would be waived. And so I think ultimately the committee is at least entitled to hear what they have to say about their public statements.
Let me ask you about the Oath Keepers. Their leader, Elmer Rhodes, as well as 10 other people, were just charged with something called seditious conspiracy. What is seditious conspiracy?
Well, it is a conspiracy, like others, an agreement. But in this one, it is to oppose by force the authority of the United States. And, you know, it has to be more than simply assaulting a police officer, a Capitol officer, as many others are accused of. It means taking on the government. And in this case, it alleges that their plot was to obstruct the peaceful transition of presidential power. That's a really big allegation, but that 48-page indictment includes detailed verbatim quotations from their text messages that, to me, indicates a very strong case that that is exactly what it was they were trying to do. And it alleges that this didn't just originate on this day, that they were conspiring before, during, and after January 6th, that they continued to amass weapons in an effort to stop the January 20th inauguration of Joe Biden. And so this is an attack on the United States, on all of us, and on democracy. It's a big charge against these individuals, and I also think it suggests that the Justice Department is looking more broadly at this conspiracy as not just the events of January 6th, but this entire attack on the 2020 election.
And before I let you go, Professor, is there any of these investigations that you are watching the most closely?
Well, it's this, January 6th one that I think I'm watching most closely. Certainly what's happening in Georgia is really interesting because I think that is a separate crime. It's a neater crime in some ways. You've got the recording, so I think there's something interesting there. The financial crimes in New York are no doubt very interesting, but they relate to Donald Trump as a businessman. I think the January 6th case is historic. I think the attack was historic. And so I am hoping that we find accountability there, not just for the people who were there, but as Merrick Garland has promised, for anyone who is responsible at any level, whether they were present or not on January 6th.
Michigan law professor Barbara McQuade, always good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Up next, we'll have another legal update, this time on Texas's controversial abortion law. The Supreme Court deals a blow to the measure's opponents. What it means in the battle over reproductive rights in Texas, just ahead. Stay close. Now, an update in the legal battle over Texas's new abortion law, known as SB 8. That battle will continue after a U.S. Supreme Court decision today, but not the way opponents of the law had hoped. NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams explains what happened.
The court declined once again to order the Texas abortion case back to the original trial judge for further proceedings. That's where the groups challenging the law say it should go. And if it did, that would have greatly accelerated their ability to move against the law. The Supreme Court in December said the law could be challenged, but it vastly trimmed back the kind of relief that opponents of the law could seek. The challenger said the case should have been returned to the federal district court judge in Texas. Instead, it was sent to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which earlier this week ensured that legal proceedings will drag out even longer by sending a question to the Texas state courts about who the challengers can sue. This was the second rejection by the Supreme Court. Justices Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan dissented. Writing for all three, Breyer said this: "The Court of Appeals ignored our judgment. It kept the case and certified questions about the licensing official defendants to the Texas Supreme Court. As a result," Breyer said, "an unconstitutional 6-week abortion ban remains in effect for Texas as it has for over 4 months," end quote. This is all about SB 8. That's the law that allows anybody to sue an abortion provider and seek a minimum of $10,000. Back to you.
Thank you, Pete. That's NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams in Washington. Up ahead, President Biden is 1 year in and new polls are out. His approval is declining, even within his base. We'll dive into the latest NBC News poll and consider how the president might turn things around.
Is the job done? Is the work done? No. That's why we elected presidents for 4-year terms, not a 1-year term. We've made a lot of progress in this year, but there is a lot more work left to be done.
Today is Joe Biden's first anniversary as president. It has been a highly challenging year, clearly, and he acknowledged that during his press conference yesterday.
I don't think there's been much on any incoming president's plate that's been a bigger menu than the plate I had given to me. I'm not complaining. Knew that running in. And the fact of the matter is we got an awful lot done.
Indeed, the administration tackled some big tasks last year, but that seems not to have impressed voters very much, because the polls show the president's approval rating is sliding, something he brushed aside at the news conference.
How do you plan to win back moderates and independents who cast a ballot for you in 2020, but polls indicate aren't happy with the way you're doing your job now?
I don't believe the polls.
Maybe not, but the numbers are not great, especially in light of where he started. And that is also reflected in our latest NBC News poll. Let's start with his approval rating. By our measurement, that stands at 43%. How does that compare historically? Well, if you look at other presidents' approval ratings, 1 year in, all the way back to JFK, President Biden's rating is quite low. It is second only to his predecessor, Donald Trump. The president received his worst rating on the economy. 6 in 10 voters say they disapprove of the way he is handling that. On COVID, just over 40% say they approve of the president's performance now. It was 69% back in April, 3 months after he took office. And as you can see, it has continued to more or less steadily decrease. Let's dig in further with NBC senior political editor Mark Murray. And Mark, I wonder what your big takeaway is from the poll numbers so far.
You know, Joshua, I think the biggest takeaway really is that this first year can be divided up in a really successful first half of Joe Biden's presidency, about first year, and then a really tough second half to the year. And by meaning that, when you look at the first year, when Joe Biden was at 53% approval rating in our poll back in April, you had just passed the COVID relief bill. They were pumping millions of shots into arms for the coronavirus. There was a lot of movement already on infrastructure and even the nascent Build Back Better plan. And then all of a sudden, in the second half, starting in August, you ended up seeing what the situation that played out in Afghanistan, the rise of the Omicron variant, then the Delta variant, as well as rising inflation. And so all the successes that the president ended up having in the first half of the year, it's really been a very tough second half of the year. And I think our poll reflects that.
Is there anything that the president is polling well on? I mean, foreign policy or any other issues? Is it all bad news all the way across the board, or are there signs of life, signs of success?
There are some signs of life and success, Joshua, but the signs of, I think, bleakness and despondency are probably ended up greater. We asked in our poll people on the question on what kind of presidential qualities they had, and President Biden ended up getting his highest remarks on his knowledge and experience in handling the job. But where he ended up actually suffering some of his lowest marks were on some of what we thought were his calling cards, either from the 2020 presidential race or his inaugural address. I'm talking about unity and bringing the country together, having competency to tackle the job, and being able to handle a crisis, with the president getting majorities of Americans giving him low marks on all those questions. And then on the issues themselves, whether it's the coronavirus or on the economy or on foreign policy, majorities disapprove of the president's handling. And it is kind of going back to that first half versus second half dichotomy. In the first half, the president was above water. In our April poll, nearly 7 in 10 Americans ended up approving his job on the coronavirus. Well, now that's down into the 40s, and that just kind of shows you, I think, what was a very successful first half and a very tough second half.
What do you make of that? I mean, I remember when we were covering the election and talking about whether Americans wanted 4 more years of Donald Trump or 4 years of a more conventional, steady hand, steeped in the ways of Washington, moderate to kind of progressive Democrat, certainly different from Bernie Sanders. He reminded us yesterday he's not Bernie Sanders. And the read after the election was, well, okay, we want someone a little more conventional. Americans want to rein it back in a little bit, kind of get out of the mode of blowing Washington up, and just kind of have a steady hand at the wheel. I think arguably he has been that, and Americans are not satisfied with what they said they wanted.
Yeah, Joshua, I think it's important. I'm glad you brought up Donald Trump because the fact that the former president is out of the equation right now, Joe Biden is in the governing stage. This isn't the politicking. And so when you're in the governing stage, sometimes your own side gets depressed, gets deflated. There's always some kind of losses. The governing's always hard. Campaigning is easier. You get everybody on your side. The other thing that's going on is just the big polarization in this country, where only a sliver of Republicans would even be able to approve of Joe Biden's job as president. So he already starts out at a ceiling of about 53 to 55% job approval rating. But the other thing that's going on is that the middle has really collapsed for Joe Biden. Independents in our poll have gone from 61% approval in April to just 36% now. That's a 25-point drop. But it's just not the middle. It's also, you end up looking at key portions of the Democratic base. African Americans have declined 19 points from April until now. Younger voters have declined. So have Latinos and women. And so it's, he has taken on erosion from the middle as well as the left. And I think that's part of the governing. It's part of polarization. And then the final equation, Joshua, is that this, with the virus still around, it is an easy recipe for people just feeling that the country is not on the right track, that something is amiss, even with an unemployment rate at 3.9%, even with record job growth, that something out there just doesn't feel right. And a big part of that is that we're in a pandemic.
And briefly, Mark, before we move on, how do you see the president resetting that first? I remember a lot was made yesterday, the fact that he said he was going to try to break Build Back Better up into smaller bills that maybe could be tackled in pieces. That sounds like a big shift.
It is a shift, and it's if he wants to be able to get something done, it is absolutely clear that the solution is having Joe Manchin write the legislation, or pretty darn close to that. But really smart Democratic strategists have told me, Joshua, that the best way to get Joe Biden's numbers up and to get Democrats kind of rallying around each other is to turn the page on the governing side of the Biden presidency and begin to turn to the campaign and to begin to unite people and have an enemy. It is really striking to me. There's been so much anger on the left about Kyrsten Sinema, and already there are primary efforts to primary her in 2024. But that actually, that ignores that there's a competitive gubernatorial and Senate contest this year in Arizona, particularly with a Trump-backed endorsement of Carrie Lake, who has been running on a lot of Donald Trump's lies and conspiracy theories. And this woman could very well end up being governor of Arizona, which will once again be a key battleground in 2024. And in this governing stage, Democrats are so caught up in the conflict within the party and really not putting their focus and the eyes on the prize on how do you end up beating Republicans either in the midterms or in 2024.
So what you're saying is it's going to be a busy year. Got it. Especially Arizona. Arizona is going to be one to watch. Thank you, Mark. That's NBC Senior Political Editor Mark Murray joining us tonight. Much appreciated. Now, one agenda item on President Biden's list was funding for historically black colleges and universities. As we enter year 2 of the Biden presidency, how confident are HBCUs that this money is coming? Students at Howard University and at Alabama A&M University spoke with NBC News Now correspondent Isa Gutierrez.
Historic black colleges and universities have done so much with so little. That's why I proposed for over a year. I'm going to invest $70 billion.
My administration has delivered $5 billion so far to HBCUs just this year. Just this year. More to come.
During his campaign and into his first year in office, President Joe Biden promised that his administration would prioritize funding for historically black colleges and universities.
On the campaign, we were hearing upwards of 70 to at least $45 billion. And then when we got into office, we had different plans. As Build Back Better is anticipated to be dwindled down, the infrastructure bill was split.
Do you feel that funding is an issue at your school?
Absolutely. I feel like HBCU students are just not prioritized.
We checked in with a few current HBCU students to ask them if they think the president followed through.
I feel like when it comes to funding on a federal level and even the way that money is allocated through our institutions, the students are thought of last. I'm tired of being put on the back burner.
Many Howard students like Anaya Vines hit a boiling point last fall, hundreds staging a sit-in on campus protesting housing conditions.
I had to pay out of pocket and move to Silver Spring, Maryland, because I'm a senior right now, and there wasn't any housing for me. They only let freshmen and sophomores get housing on campus.
And for Smith, a senior at Alabama A&M, a lack of funding is a big roadblock to learning.
We don't have enough qualified, knowledgeable advisors. We want more professors to offer different classes. Or more classes, we need better funding.
We reached out to Howard University and they said in part that they advertised additional housing for juniors and seniors and work hard to ensure those who need housing receive housing. Alabama A&M University did not respond to our request for comment.
When you heard that President Joe Biden was committing to this, he said that he was going to make HBCUs a priority during his term. Initially, what were your thoughts?
If you want me to be completely honest, I didn't believe it from Joe. At the end of the day, this is not the first time HBCU students and Black people, period, in America have been given false promises on campaigns.
I was more naive. I thought the promise would be kept. We all know how the game is played.
It's so unfortunate to hear us say that's just how the game is played, because this isn't a game.
Do you have hope that the Biden administration will do right by HBCUs?
I'll say yes. I will say yes.
I'm going to say that the most hope that I have is in students.
I have mixed feelings about it because I love optimism because we need people like that. Like, we're still going through a pandemic. I really don't expect them to look at college students, especially just even put HBCU students on the focal point. I don't see it happening.
NBC News reached out to the Biden administration asking them to comment on the students' criticisms. They did not respond.
What do you want to see from the Biden administration in the next year?
That commitment that they made to us in the beginning, $43 billion was supposed to be given to historically Black colleges and universities.
But for Joe Biden, my expectations are extremely low, grass level, and with Kamala Harris. What I really want for you to do is just hold yourself accountable. What you promised on your campaign.
Just do what you said you were going to do. I don't want an installment payment of this $43 billion. I want it all up front, direct deposit, no partial payments, no, we'll pay you back in 4 years, re-elect Kamala. No, we're not doing that.
That was NBC's Isa Gutierrez reporting. The administration is preparing to send out hundreds of millions of N95 masks. But are there enough to go around? One major supplier says, yeah. You'll hear why before we go. We've been talking about what Americans think of the president's performance 1 year in. COVID is obviously one of the top issues at hand. Lately, the administration has introduced a wide range of strategies: free at-home tests, sending masks and tests to schools, new vaccination sites, and more. Well, now the White House will send free N95 masks to locations across the country, 400 million of them. Last week, the CDC updated its guidance, stating that N95 and KN95 masks provide the best protection against COVID. But anything COVID-related can be hard to find. So, how will companies keep up? 3M is among the companies producing these masks. CNBC's Seema Modi spoke with the president of 3M's personal safety division, and she joins us now. Seema, talk about the White House's plan and how 3M hopes to fit into that.
Well, Joshua, unlike what we saw at the height of the pandemic, 3M does not foresee any risk of a shortage. It's ramped up production over the last 2 years, expanded assembly lines, hired more workers at its plants in South Dakota and Nebraska. 3M executive Ray Eby telling me it's already supplied the government with hundreds of millions of N95s, and that the key goal now is to replenish the U.S. stockpile.
The stockpile that the government built last year, which is going to be a key element of being able to get these out to everybody. And so I think that's a great plan. And of course, to supplement that, we've got our production, and of course, we'll be supplementing wherever the government needs us, and then stand ready, of course, to replenish that stockpile so that it's ready when we need it in the future as well.
And of course, that will be the key goal going forward, Joshua.
Now, Seema, I just want to underscore what you just said, is that 3M does not feel like supply is going to be a problem going forward in terms of masks, which has kind of been the case with a lot of products, right? It used to be you couldn't find Lysol on the shelves, and now it's much more plentiful. So that's the supply piece of it. What about the demand piece of it, especially now that there are so many more places and more coming online every day where you can get these masks?
No, it's such a great point, Joshua. You go to the store, you go online, there are many more options available. It's becoming, in fact, a more crowded market with different types of masks. But 3M is confident that N95s will remain the gold standard because of its effectiveness.
And we make the best, and people can count on us. They've been counting on us for decades. I know that there may be cheaper options for some folks in the market, but our N95s are available. And we'll continue to make them. So no, I'm not worried about the competition.
And Seema, one of the other issues with masks, particularly N95 masks, is that many of them were made to fit adults and not children. And that's been a big concern, trying to find masks for kids. Now, kids can get vaccinated, but of course, if we're sending masks to schools, they're going to need masks that can fit the little ones too. How is that being dealt with?
Yeah, and this is a big topic of discussion, Joshua. In general, the company says it's been testing out new designs and fits. Innovation is really top of mind, and says scientists are in discussions to create a potential version for kids if and when NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety, provides approval. NIOSH currently only regulates N95s for adults right now. So a lot of conversations around if that will change in the new future. Of course, clearly something that a lot of families are thinking about, especially as you say children return to school.
And Seema, before I got to let you go, one last thing. Did you get a sense from 3M of how this fits into their overall business plan? I mean, for some companies during the pandemic, especially pharmaceutical companies, COVID turned out to dramatically change their bottom lines. I think it's safe to say that the vaccine has revolutionized Moderna, for example, and sent its profits through the roof in dramatic ways. How big is this in 3M's business among all the other things that 3M does?
So it's definitely become a growth business for 3M ever since the onset of the pandemic in February of 2020. This is a company that scaled and really increased the number of 995s it could produce and sell and distribute across the world, with now 2.5 billion on average per year. Still, it remains a smaller business within 3M because this is a highly diversified company that makes everything from sticky notes to Post-its to a lot of electrical gear. So it's one of those diversified American manufacturers that is right now very well known for its N95s.
That's CNBC's Seema Modi. Seema, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now, as we mentioned, free at-home COVID tests are now available, 500 million of them. The official website to place orders is now online. Here's NBC's Jo-Ling Kent.
How is the website working so far? Any problems, any issues?
We're very pleased with the website so far. It's gone through a whole series of tests, load testing and professionals working with it in the last week, and so far so good.
Dr. Tom Inglesby is overseeing the national testing efforts for the Biden administration after the White House announced last year that 500 million tests will be sent nationwide, then doubling that number to 1 billion last week.
We have more than 200 million tests that are available in laboratories and point of care settings. We have school channels. We have channels for long-term care facilities to get more than 3 million free tests every week from the government. So we are bringing tests to the most vulnerable people.
But nearly 2 years into the pandemic, public health experts like epidemiologist Abigail Echohawk disagree with that assessment.
We've submitted orders from both to the federal government, to the state, to the county, and received about 100 tests at this point in time when we need at least 1,000.
Echohawk is the executive vice president of the Seattle Indian Health Board and a citizen of the Pawnee Nation.
How do you think the Biden administration has done so far?
We're seeing a lot of efforts to get home tests to folks and into agencies' hands. But however, despite all of the best efforts, we're still severely lacking in getting the number of tests that are needed, particularly for marginalized populations who are experiencing some of the worst impacts of COVID-19. And that has been the struggle throughout this pandemic, is we have not seen true equity actually happen. What we've seen is a lot of words and not as much action that has actually impacted those who need it the most.
What is your response to that?
We started in December a program to distribute 50 million free tests to community health centers and rural health clinics. We have dedicated programs for schools. We have dedicated programs for homeless shelters, for people living in carceral settings.
The free tests, 4 per household, the White House says will ship by mail 7 to 12 days after orders are placed on covidtests.gov. And so far, the only way to order is online, a challenge for people unable to access the internet and who lack a physical address, like many on Indian reservations and across rural America.
What are you doing to make sure that tests will be distributed in an equitable fashion, especially for people who don't have access to the internet?
Yes, and we do know that a important portion of the country does not use the internet for one reason or another. It may be disability or by choice or lack of access, and we have full commitment to make sure that those people have the same opportunity to order these tests as those who do use the internet or have internet access. And so there will be a call-in line that is established for people to be able to call and order tests through that process.
When will we see that phone number?
It's coming soon.
That was NBC's Jo-Ling Kent reporting. Finally, we would love your questions for 2 upcoming conversations. First, it's tax time. Yay! This Monday is the first day of income tax season. You have until April 18th to file, and from what we have heard, the sooner you file, the better. So, We want your questions about this year's returns, especially if the pandemic has changed your living situation. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. We also want your questions for tomorrow's program about the future of work. The Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, will join us to discuss a new workforce development program. So we'd love your questions about the future of jobs in America. What's the greatest need where you live? Reach out on social media, voicemail, email. Feel free to submit questions for both segments, jobs and taxes if you want, and follow us online so you'll be the first to know about upcoming topics and guests. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.